Letters of a Woman Homesteader by Eleanor Pruitt Stewart. Chapter 10. At last the time came and Mrs. O'Shaughnessy went after the parents. Long before they had repented and were only too glad to go. The poor mother lived one day and night after the baby came. She laid the tiny thing in her mother's arms and told them to call her Corabelle. She told them she gave them a pure little daughter in place of the sinful one they had lost. That was almost 12 years ago, and the Edmondsons have lived in the new house all this time. The deed to the place was made out to Corabelle, and her grandfather is her guardian. If you traveled due north from my home, after about 9 hours' ride, you would come into an open space in the butte lands, and away between two buttes you would see the glimmer of blue water. As you drew nearer, you would be able to see the fringe of willows around the lake, and presently a low, red-roofed house with corrals and stables. You would see long lines of buck fence, a flock of sheep nearby, and cattle scattered about feeding. This is Corabelle's home. On the long, low porch, you would see two old folks rocking. The man is small and has rheumatism in his legs and feet so badly that he can barely hobble. The old lady is large and fat and is also afflicted with rheumatism, but has it in her arms and shoulders. They are both cheerful and hopeful, and you would get a cordial welcome. When you saw Corabelle, you would see a stout, square-built little figure with long flaxen braids, a pair of beautiful brown eyes, and the longest and whitest lashes you ever saw, a straight nose, a short upper lip, a broad, full forehead, the whole face neither pretty nor ugly, plentifully sown with the brownest freckles. She is very truly the head of the family, doing all the housework and looking after the stock winter and summer entirely by herself. 3 years ago she took things into her own hands, and since that time has managed altogether. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy, however, tells her what to do. The sheep, 40 in number, are the result of her individual efforts. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy told her there was more money in raising lambs than in raising chickens. So she quit the chickens as a business and went to some of the big sheep men and got permission to take the doggy lambs, which they are glad to give away. She had plenty of cows, so she milked cows and fed lambs all day long all last year. This year she has 40 head of nice sheep worth $4 each, and she doesn't have to feed them the year round as she would chickens. And the wolves are no worse to kill sheep than they are to kill chickens. When shearing time came, she went to a sheepman and told him she would help cook for his men 1 week if he would have her sheep sheared with his. She said her work was worth $3. That is what one man would get a day shearing, and he could easily shear her sheep in 1 day. That is how she got her sheep sheared. The man had her wool hauled to town with his, sold it for her, and it brought $60. She took her money to Mrs. O'Shaughnessy. She wanted some supplies ordered before she went home because, as she gravely said, the rheumatiz would get all the money she had left when she got home, meaning that her grandparents would spend what remained for medicine. The poor old grandparents read all the time of wonderful cures that different dopes accomplish, and they spend every nickel they can get their hands on for nostrums. They try everything they read of and have to buy it by the case. Horrid patent stuff. They have rolls of testimonials and believe every word, so they keep on trying and hoping. When there is any money, they each order whatever medicine they want to try. If Mrs. Edmondson's doesn't seem to help her, Grandpa takes it and she takes his. That is their idea of economy. They would spend hours telling you about their different remedies and would offer you spoonful after spoonful of vile-looking liquid and be mildly grieved when you refused to take it. Grandma's hands are so bent and twisted that she can't sew, so dear old Grandpa tries to do it. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy told me that she helped out when she could. 3 years ago she made them all a complete outfit, but the rheumatiz has been getting all the spare money since then, so there has been nothing to sew. A peddler sold them a piece of gingham which they made up for Cora Belle. It was broad pink and white stripes, and they wanted some style to Corey's clothes, so they cut a gored skirt. But they had no pattern and made the gores by folding a width of the goods biasly and cutting it that way. It was put together with no regard to matching the stripes, and a bias seam came in the center behind, but they put no stay in the seam, and the result was the most outrageous affair imaginable. Well, we had a large room almost empty, and Mr. Stewart liked the idea of a party. So Mrs. Louderer, Mrs. O'Shaughnessy, and myself planned for the event. It was to be a sewing bee, a few good neighbors invited, and all to sew for Grandma. So Mrs. O'Shaughnessy went to Grandma's and got all the material she had to make up. I had saved some sugar bags and some flour bags. I knew Cora Belle needed underwear, so I made her some little petticoats of the larger bags and some drawers of the smaller. I had a small piece of white lawn that I had no use for, and of that I made a dear little sunbonnet with a narrow edging of lace around, and also made a gingham bonnet for her. 2 days before the time came Mrs. Louderer laden with bundles, and Mrs. O'Shaughnessy also laden. We had all been thinking of Cora Belle. Mr. Stewart had sent by mail for her a pair of sandals for everyday wear, and a nice pair of shoes, also some stockings. Mrs. Louderer brought cloth for 3 dresses of heavy Dutch calico and gingham for 3 aprons. She made them herself, and she sews so carefully. She had bought patterns, and the little dresses were stylishly made, as well made. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy brought a piece of crossbar with a tiny forget-me-not polka dot, and also had goods and embroidery for a suit of underwear. My own poor efforts were already completed when the rest came, so I was free to help them.